Welcome to Garden Views, interesting conversations with interesting people who have done and or are doing interesting things. So sit back and enjoy.
Welcome everyone into Garden Views, and on this episode we're going to be pursuing something called government ethics, and I say pursuing it because it seems like it's hard to catch. And our guest today is Suzanne Munson, and she's going to educate us on something that it was referred to as the Virginia Way, and some of the work that she's done on a gentleman named George Wythe, who I've heard the name. I'm sure most people haven't, but maybe was the Socrates or Plato, if you will, of American jurisprudence and government civics. But without further ado, I want to say hello and greet Suzanne Munson. Thank you for coming into Garden Views and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sure. I guess before we get started with the crux, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, I retired from the corporate world and nonprofit world about 10 years ago. And the day I decided to leave, I said, oh boy, I can do this book I've been wanting to do for so long. And that was a biography of Thomas Jefferson's teacher, his primary mentor, George Wythe, who was a founding father, but he's called the forgotten founding father because he never ran for a high office and he didn't have children to keep his legacy going. But he was very, very important in getting America off to the right start after the Revolution. And so he has a great story, and I wanted to tell it because it's important for today. He was a very ethical person, and he believed in the ideal of the ethical public servant in government.
And is he found, or wasn't the first law school in the United States named after him?
Yes. Lawyers, of course, we still have our jokes about lawyers, but they were really held in very low esteem before the American Revolution, before America's first collegiate law school was founded. And as a matter of fact, Virginia being the first colony, the oldest colony, about 50 years after the colony was formed, lawyers were disbarred from courthouses because the worst sort had come over from London to prey on the innocent colonists. And so the training of lawyers was mostly by apprenticeship. Only the very wealthy could send their sons to England to learn English law, being most of the colonies being English. So it was a huge breakthrough to form America's first law school. And that was in Williamsburg in 1779 at the College of William and Mary, which is the second oldest college in America after Harvard.
Of course, Harvard. Always getting in there first.
Yeah, but Harvard, I got to get a little dig in about Harvard here. Harvard's law school didn't start until 30 years later. And so they claim to be the oldest law school in America, but in the fine print, it's in continuous operation. There's a little proviso there.
I see. So there's a loophole.
Law school at the College of William and Mary was the first and the oldest, but it was interrupted by 2 wars and some economic deprivation.
Aha. All right. So we get to the truth of that. So, all right. So I know that you noted that Wythe, I pronounced it Wythe earlier, which is, of course, is what happens when you only read a name and not actually hear of a name before, or perhaps somebody mispronounced it to me in my past. But seems to have educated Jefferson, Monroe, John Marshall. I mean, John Adams. I mean, these names are the who's who. These are the signatories to the Declaration of Independence, the first Supreme Court justice, presidents. So I don't know. I guess it's your story to tell. Who do you want to start with? But I know that you focus on Jeffersonian democracy, so maybe we'll start with Jefferson.
Yes, Wythe educated either directly or indirectly, or influenced the first Virginia presidents of the United States. He was a friend of George Washington's. They were about the same age. And he was Washington's personal lawyer. and he held us back when Wythe was in the Virginia legislature and in the Continental Congress. He made sure that Washington was funded for the wars that he was engaged in. And so he directly influenced Thomas Jefferson. He was Jefferson's most important mentor. And Jefferson met him when he was just an unruly, well, I won't say unruly, but kind of a wayward college student. He was away from home. His home was more than 100 miles away. He had very little supervision. And if you read some of his letters to his grandchildren, he will say that, yes, he could have easily gotten off on the wrong foot. He was hanging out at the racetrack with card sharps and jockeys and so on. And so in a letter to his grandson, he said, I had a decision to make. Who was I going to be like? Was I going to be like the racetrack jockeys, or was I going to hang out there and make my life there? And a lot of the students that he was with at William and Mary were rich planters' sons, and they planned to go back and play cards and run their farm and not engage particularly in higher politics and so on, or government affairs. So Wythe had a profound influence on Jefferson. He also taught Chief Justice John Marshall, who was one of the most influential Chief Justices in American history. And Henry Clay came under his influence. Clay is kind of being forgotten now, but he was tremendously influential congressman and senator right before the Civil War. He was called the Great Compromiser. He had a high sense of ethics. And so Wythe taught at his law school. He turned his law school into a training program for statesmen. And he wanted his students to be more than just lawyers, just members of a profession. And most of them enrolled in his law school to make money, go home, make money, open up a law firm. The shingle would read, student of the great George Wythe, and so the career would go on from there. But he encouraged them, he inspired them to become ethical public servants, to lead the new country, because after the Revolution, we were reinventing ourselves, and Virginia was one of the first to reinvent itself, even though the war was far from being won, but set up a new court system, new educational system, new constitution. And so there were offices opening up at the national level and at the state level. They needed to be filled by well-educated individuals, and beyond that, by ethically motivated individuals. There were also many positions opening up in the judiciary. The Supreme Court was brand new. The federal judgeships were brand new. The state level judgeships were being created, new positions. And so who was going to fill those jobs? Who was trained to operate within a new democratic republic? Nobody had ever operated within a democratic republic before. We had always been ruled by aristocrats and kings and queens.
Well, I can hear members of the audience out there. I can hear their voices and their thoughts already. And I just want to let people know that we are going to judge these men, partly in the context of their times, but mostly for their government ethical approaches, their statesmanship, their civics, so to speak. We're not going to judge them today on if they were slaveholders and if they were adulterers and if it was a rich man's club. The audience is free to do so. We are all free to do so, make those judgments. But right today we're going to be talking about ethics in government, and we're going to try to separate those, or at least that where we are purposely avoiding those issues because that's not the conversation for today. We're not ignoring them and saying they did not exist. They clearly existed. We know that there were slaveholders. We know that there were adulterers. We know that people did not recognize their children, and that it might sound weird to some people to call certain people ethical while they didn't subscribe to maybe ethics of their own religions, and certainly not the ethics of our time. But we're going to judge them on the building a government kind of a civics 101 level. I hope that is clear, and I hope that helps things out. going forward, because we do want to take this in the context of today and what's been not when I say today, I don't mean June 6, 2023 when we're recording this. I mean in our modern era where so many of our guardrails have been pushed or tested, and so many are still being tested. And I think one of the things we've learned in the last half dozen years or so is just how much depends on the good faith of people, how much depends on an honor code. Instead of using crafty interpretations, we've learned something called the emoluments clause and learned that maybe it doesn't mean anything. We're having a conflict right now as to whether or not the Presidential Records Act over or supersedes commander-in-chief status. I mean, all sorts of things that never would have been thought of. We have governors, busing undocumented or illegal aliens, whatever term you want to use, busing them and flying them into other states. And then other governors and mayors are sort of shooting back. And there's all sorts of craziness going on that, it seems medieval, but it's happening right now. And, maybe it's because we have that lack of civility is tied directly to a lack of ethics. So that's my little spiel. But what do you think of all that, Suzanne?
Well, that's a really good point, Jeff. I think we need to separate conduct in public office versus conduct at home. Yes, most of the founding fathers, at least from the South, did own slaves. Thomas Jefferson was an ardent abolitionist in his youth, and he actually proposed laws to end slavery gradually. And they were literally shouted down, and it would be impossible for the Virginia General Assembly to ever pass a law, even gradually freeing slaves. It was ingrained not only in the South, but in the North. The lords of the loom, the textile manufacturers were dependent on the lords of the lash in the South. The whole country was involved in it. So let's say, and of course, it is true that owning slaves, in our point of view, was a sin. It was a sin. But we're all sinners. And even sinners can do great things in other parts of their lives. So we don't want to forget the enormous contributions that these people made to making this a free country today for formerly enslaved people. Formerly enslaved people are freer today than most of the people in the rest of the world by virtue of what the founding fathers did for everyone. But it took a while, for that to be extended to females as well as to people of color. Females were left out of the system too, and also denigrated for their intellect. Got to remember that. But these men were products of their time. But that doesn't negate the good things that they did. I mean, that's intellectually dishonest to throw everybody under the bus for one sin or several sins.
Yeah, I have found that part of my opinion anyways, part of the lack of civility and the polarization of our nation, our politics, is that simply a lot of people don't understand the basic civics, basically the separation of powers. What's the difference between Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3? What does federalism mean? And part of it is that we sort of left a monarchy and sort of been slipping and sliding ever closer to trying to create a new one. And we created federalism, but have, more and more, there's more and more demands. And a lot of them are very good intentioned: public health, voting rights, equal rights, fair commerce, things like that, get federalized. And then it gets very confusing when you have different state laws. And, federalism is important, or states' rights are important when states' rights are important. Federal supremacy is important when federal supremacy is important. And depending on your viewpoints on certain issues, there's very little ideological consistency with it. But just beyond that, a lot of people say, well, the president should be able to do this. Well, no, the president can't necessarily do this. Congress has to do this, or Congress has to do that for it to be lasting or permanent. When should the courts intervene? When shouldn't they intervene? And things like that. And I think that a lot of people just don't understand the separation of powers and the framework by which our constitutional system was built. It's not a pure democracy; it's a democratic republic. I think a lot of people don't understand what that is. I think a lot of people eschew the idea of land having value over people per se. 2 senators per state, no matter how many people are in it. Things of that nature. And the framers, they codified all this and did most of it on purpose. And their arguments and their thoughts are well documented in places like the federal papers and footnotes and all sorts of writings. But it's a pain to read all that. And it's also written in a kind of English which is not modern English. It's very heady and it's heavy language. So, again, I guess that was a little bit of a speech on my part. But I think it's probably a natural segue into probably the bulk of your presentation.
Well, I was lucky. I know a semester, and it might have been a year of government in high school. I had a good government teacher, and I learned about the separation of powers. And we've had some presidents who have never understood the separation of powers, and people in Congress as well. I think we've had some people up there in Washington who are fairly poorly educated about how the government works. And, there's a test to be a plumber. There's a test to be an electrician. There's a test to be almost anything that you can think of that has to do with public safety, engineering. There should be a test for people who run for Congress and even maybe for the presidency. They should be schooled in the Constitution, in the separation of powers. It was very, very important for the Founding Fathers to have separation of powers, or else one branch of government would run away with everything. If you didn't have some controls on the presidency, easily we could have had a dictatorship any number of times. If you didn't have 2 houses of Congress, the House of Representatives could go crazy and have no rails. But fortunately, the bills have to go to the Senate, which is known as the cooling place for maybe some hotheads in the House. And so you have a balance of power, and then you have the court system. And if you can't get redress anywhere else, you should get redress in an impartial court system. And here we get back to ethics. The court judges should be impartial. They shouldn't run on party lines as they are doing now in many states. That's an abomination.
Right. So you noted 4 main topics that you want to talk about, and one was a lack of ethics, which you'd think would speak a little bit for itself. But I'm sure that you have some examples that you want to lend us, and then maybe point out how some of the people that you wrote about would have treated some of these items. But anyway, I don't want to hijack your presentation. So the first topic is a lack of ethics.
Yes. Well, I identified 4 concerns that our founding fathers would have about our government today. A lack of ethics being one. It's very easy for somebody to come into Congress as a middle-class person and end up as a very wealthy person.
Right.
How does that happen? There's our Congresswoman, Abigail Spanberger, who I happen to have a great regard for, has a bill in Congress right now that would make it illegal for people in Congress and senators to deal in stocks. They get tips way ahead of time and ahead of big actions. Sure. On the stock market, and lots of them have cashed in on that. And so she has a bill to make that harder for self-dealing.
Right.
And we all know that self-dealing goes on, and it has gone on in Congress for many, many generations. Congress was very corrupt in the end of the 19th century. And there was some cleanup of that and civil service and so on. But so it's not new, and but we need to address it. And another thing the founding fathers would be totally concerned about, and this sort of ties in with the first issue, and that is the decline of journalism in this country. Daily newspapers have been going out of business, and local newspapers have been going out of business for some time, and that is a very, very frightening prospect. Freedom of the press is embedded in our First Amendment. It was something that Jefferson and the other founding fathers held very dear to the future success of this democratic republic. When newspaper staffs are gutted, as they have been by the venture capitalists, vultures I call them, if you have fewer investigative reporters, you're going to have less corruption revealed to the public by public officials, or even just stupid mistakes. It doesn't have to be corruption, just be stupidity. But if people aren't reporting on the government, and if people aren't reading the reports, that's another problem. People are kind of zoning out. They're on TikTok instead of, reading the newspaper or listening to the news. So it's really very, very alarming what's happening with our journalism today. Not just the decline of the daily newspaper and the decline of investigative reporting, but also a decline in truthfulness. And we all know that certain stations have gotten into big trouble for not telling the truth. They've had lawsuits, and they've lost those lawsuits fairly. Not naming any names, but we all know who we're talking about.
Sure.
And also recently, the heads, the chief gurus of the technical world have put out an alarm about artificial intelligence and future elections. They say there's a very real probability that images will be manipulated. What people are saying will be manipulated, and it will look like the truth, but it won't be the truth, and nobody will be able to tell one thing from another. They say that is a great danger that we're facing.
Yeah, that technology is already there.
This is fake news on steroids, and we should be very alarmed about it, and there should be ways to counter it. There should be truth monitors, if you can trust the truth monitors.
That's a problem.
And people are listening to a lot of garbage, on social media. There's a lot of very untruthful stuff being said on social media.
Oh, sure. I mean, and the decline of respect for the media because of some of the things that they've done to themselves by acting in such ways and printing poor stories or being so partisan, they've driven a lot of the audience to find other sources. And so they rely on, some guy or gal on YouTube, that may or may not have the degrees that they say they have, or, an Alex Jones rises or whatever the case may be. But, I follow ratings and TV pretty closely, and it seems like Fox News currently is the only network that consistently has in the millions. That CNN is around 300,000 or 400,000, on average. MSNBC is about 70,000 less than that, and Newsmax is around the same as MSNBC. AON went out of business, and NPR, I don't even know that there's numbers for that. Now, I don't know about the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and regular broadcast Fox. But you're right. People aren't, they're not even watching TV anymore. They've moved to other sources, be it social media. And, I guess it's who polices the police. You said that who's going to believe the truth minders, who do you find?
Right. Well, one thing, in the 20th century, schools of journalism were developed across the country at major universities. And those who majored in journalism were taught to be objective. They were taught that you should not slant the news according to your opinion. And this was a rule. And also, a young reporter who might make mistakes always had editors to catch the mistakes and to vet for the truth. That is going by the wayside. You have a lot of people who are not trained in journalism. They're not trained in journalism ethics. They think it's okay to slant things according to their own perspective,
right,
because their perspective is the right one. and the way everybody should think.
Well, they're a publicly traded company. They have shareholders to answer to. I mean,
Exactly.
which overrules the truth. I mean, it's a news business, which maybe is the problem. But even the not-for-profit NPR, which is supposedly a not-for-profit, I mean, it seems to, or its rep is that it has a liberal bias.
Yeah. Well, there's a certain channel that throws out red meat all the time, and it loves keeping people agitated about one thing or another. And if it's not truthful, they'll make up something. People need to be very careful where they get their information. I find it quite difficult to talk to people who get their information from questionable sources because they think that theirs is the truthful source. And, my sources aren't, although I try to stick with the sources that are as objective as possible and less partisan.
Yeah, what I try to do is find, I try and do the same as you, but because it's hard to tell who's less partisan, I try to listen to the admittedly partisan sides on both sides. And if I listen to enough of those and enough that, believe that they're centrist, somewhere in there you're going to find a truth or at least the argument that you agree with. But it's too easy to plant yourself in an echo chamber, to sort of parrot your beliefs. And and a lot of people do that, even thinking they're exposing themselves to a lot of sources of information. It's just they're listening to the different voices, but with the same types of views or opinions. But the media, I mean, as much as it certainly is part of it, the media still is private. So, I mean, government ethics, is public, and that's why I brought up NPR, because it is to an extent semi-public. I know it's semi-not, but it had the imprimatur of being publicly funded. But you're right. The ethics in journalism has left. We want to be as objective and down the middle as possible. We want to tell the truth we want to tell our audience what our audience wants to hear, or we want to tell our audience what we want our audience to believe.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Freedom of the press, as I said, as we all know, is embedded in the First Amendment. And the Constitution would not have been ratified in Virginia and in some other states without the Bill of Rights, because Patrick Henry and others feared an overwhelming, overpowerful federal government. And individual rights were extremely important to those founding fathers. Right. And so another Virginia founding father, James Madison, who's called the father of the Constitution, made sure that the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution. But the Constitution would have been a failure without the promise of the future edition of a Bill of Rights. But getting back to freedom of the press, Jefferson was very much for that, but it did bite him in a major way. And this goes back to some of his less ethical behavior. I'll have to say that there were times when his standards were a little lower than they should have been, but he had paid a man called James Callender to say some nasty things about his political opponent, who at the time was John Adams. Then Jefferson was elected president, and Mr. Callender wanted payback. He wanted a federal job. He wanted to be postmaster somewhere. Jefferson decided that he was not the man for the job. So Mr. Callender turned on him and exposed his relationship with Sally Hemings, who was his alleged slave mistress. And that was a huge scandal. But even after that, and Jefferson could have maybe proposed some laws about libel and, salacious things in the news. Now, John Adams had very skin-thin about criticism of public officials, and his some of the laws that he proposed were shouted down. But basically, the founding fathers, even though they were bitten by freedom of the press, and some of them did have thin skins, they still recognized it as a bedrock American value, and that would keep us more honest than most governments in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and the importance press is supposed to be self-regulating because of its journalistic ethical rules and integrity. And maybe it's fallen down on that. Maybe there's just too much media. I don't know. But freedom of the press, I guess, includes bad press. But there's in those 10 amendments, there's plenty of sub debates in those first 10 as well. Some of them are completely non-controversial, but obviously, like, the Second Amendment is very controversial. I don't think the no quartering of soldiers is particularly controversial, though if it came up, it probably would be, or maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. But there's, the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, a little bit less controversial, a little bit more settled. But anyway, it's no one's quite sure what the 10th Amendment means. Obviously, this is all part of a grand compromise, and the American experiment is still ongoing and is still trying to find a balance between chaos and order, basically, and the liberty and a freedom from sort of anarchy. But anyway, there are. We're probably not going to settle that here, but there were other issues that I know that you raised as concerns, and one was it's tied into this, which is you have extreme media, you also have extreme party politics. I don't know which is the chicken or which is the egg. I'm 54, so I've lived through a bunch. I'm going to say the extreme politics came before the extreme media, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're probably right. Now, during the time that the man I wrote about, George Wythe, was in public office, he was Attorney General of the colony, Virginia, and he was Speaker of the House of the legislature in Virginia. During that time, partisan politics had not raised its ugly head. That started during probably the second term of George Washington's term. And then it got really, really ugly, between the Federalists and the states' rights people and the people of various persuasions. And those politics during those early days were pretty vicious, as was the media. And but I'm concerned. I've been seeing a lot of political signs here where I live in Virginia, and I live in a county. And in Virginia, the county government is run by according to districts, and each district has a supervisor. So I'm seeing all these signs for Republican supervisors and Democratic supervisors, and honestly, that should not be a factor. I mean, you need a good supervisor who has a good business head and common sense and will do the right thing for the people. A supervisor can't do anything about these hot issues like abortion or anything else. They don't have that power. So, but people are going to vote for party lines. And I know people who will only vote for a Republican. And back in the old days, I used to know people who would only vote for a Democrat. They were called yellow dog Democrats. People are very, very rigid now about their party affiliations. And I have to tell one friend, I said, hey, there's good Democrats and bad Democrats. There's good Republicans and bad Republicans. And you need to be discerning. You need to think critically. Well, that was a new thought to him. He was only going to vote one way, no matter who the person was. And I'm an independent voter. I vote for the lesser of two evils or the best man or woman.
Right. Yeah. And people sometimes say, oh, it's a binary choice. You're going for the lesser of two evils. Well, yeah. I mean, sometimes it is. And that's life. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good or the better. So in some of the other items, I mean, what you were just talking about with the supervisors, you had a section about judges as well. And, some judges are elected, and that makes them politicians, which also applies to sheriffs and things like that, which is, sort of troublesome. But then I was thinking, here, if they're appointed, it's the same problem. They just have to they just have to declare their loyalty sort of to the governor or so they're still in politics. Either way, it's politically tainted. Is there any sort of objective way to appoint judges? Are there any states that don't have elections or a governor appoints, and there's some other, like the bar association or some committee between the bar association and local officials or bipartisan, some third way to do it that's better?
You can find this online. I went online to find out which states elect their judges and which states appoint them, and you can, of course, if you live in a state like Texas, you know that the judges are running for election because they've got their ads all over the place.
Right.
And you know that some judges are running as Republicans and some judges are running as Democrats. That's just flat out wrong. A judge should be objective. We all have our biases and we can't pretend that we don't. But you should have the best qualified, best educated judge and the judge with the best temperament, the best judicial temperament on the bench. Now, in Virginia, there was a lot of dialogue, and I have it in my first book, which is called Jefferson's Godfather. That's about George Wythe. There are letters exchanged between George Wythe and his former student, Thomas Jefferson, about what the judiciary should look like. And they were talking about the temperament of judges and that judges should be appointed for life, assuming good behavior. You can get rid of a judge who's gone off the rails. But if they don't have to run for re-election, they're more likely to be objective. If they're worried about offending somebody and not getting elected the next time, that will be a factor. If somebody has given them a great big fat campaign contribution, that will be a factor when that person's business comes up before the judge. This is another thing that needs to be reported and probably will go unreported in the future. But I think there should be ways to impartially select judges. I think this is really, really important because the recent poll said that people are losing faith in the Supreme Court because it has become partisan. In the back room, these judges are saying, yes, I will vote such and such a way. They say they don't, but they're being vetted in the back room for sure. And increasingly, there are partisan views being held there that when the people should be more objective and abide by solid law. But if I were doing it, I would have, like in a state like Virginia, we've got several law schools that are well regarded, and I would have a committee of law school deans and professors, and then representatives from both parties, but the better representatives, lawyers, who are well regarded. And just try to take it out of politics and have the appointment based on merit, on education, on judicial temperament. Judicial temperament is very important too. It can be done, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and it will be hard fought.
Basically, just honoring their public service oaths. If they actually honored the public service oaths as read, then they enacted that way, then it would probably get a lot closer to where you envision. But a lot of the system depends on a fair and free press, the one that has the integrity that it keeps the respect of the public, and fair and free elections, which brings us to the last point that you raised as a concern, which is we recently were, bless you, at risk of not having a peaceful transfer of government for the first time in our history.
Okay. We're talking about the concerns of the founding fathers. And one of the bedrock values that they wanted for us was a peaceful transition of power from one president to another, one administration to another. And you only have to look south of the border to see the chaos in many of the countries down there. Dictatorships, military coups, so on. There is no stability. And the peaceful transfer of power is what they wanted most for this country, that we wouldn't be like the rest of the world, that we wouldn't be captive to dictatorships or military coups. So I think what happened on January 6th would be of tremendous concern to our founding fathers. Fortunately, the situation was in hand by the next day, but it was a very bad day in the history of America.
Well, I'm not sure it's exactly in hand. I think that's maybe it's still simmering there. There's almost like a direct line from Ruby Ridge to the simmering. But in any event, yeah, I mean, and I'm actually troubled with a lot of smart people sort of point and say, it wasn't that big a deal. You should be worried about homeless people, or you should be worried about the opioid crisis. And yeah, I can be worried about those things too, but I'm more worried about the failure of the institutions of our system of government falling in those things. I hate to say it, but there's always going to have been poor. There's always going to be homeless. But when you don't have the institutions of this government, that's just going to make all those things 10 times worse, 100 times worse. Who knows? So, I mean,
you get back to fake news on this one. Some of the commentators at the time called it a walk in the park.
Right.
And a lot of people believed them.
Right.
A lot of people I know disregarded or misunderstood how important that day was in this country.
Right. I know a lot of people still questioning things and wanting to see tapes because of the Tucker Carlson clever edits, and it's not satisfying enough for them that that hundreds of people have pleaded guilty or have been found guilty by juries of their peers who have seen video footage. Because everyone wants to be convinced for themselves because they don't trust the system anymore, and that's the problem. They don't trust the system, and at some point, the system does things to give people license not to trust it. Governments act corrupt. They make mistakes. You have Abu Ghraib, you have the weapons of mass destruction. I believe totally that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. There's all imperfect government, and then the exploitation of that by media and other influencers. Just drove wedges why most people might shake their head at it or think it's terrible or vote a different way. Now it's like you have to get into your corners.
Yeah. Well, we should have a healthy distrust of our government for sure.
Absolutely.
But you shouldn't. You shouldn't distrust government when it's actually doing the right thing. And you had a president and you had a network who lied about an election, that it was rigged. It was not rigged. That's fake news.
Right.
So people and that's undermining democracy, the very basis of democracy, a free and fair election, to say that an election was rigged simply because you lost it.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that, even some of my friends.
Sure, but this goes back a ways, and this that belief couldn't have happened if it wasn't for Bush v. Gore, if it wasn't for Hillary Clinton saying that she didn't lose the election, if it wasn't for Stacey Abrams. I don't think she's conceded her governorship election yet. I mean, this was paved. This road was paved by lesser incursions, and then you have someone like Donald Trump, who really knows no bounds and is a more charismatic leader and has more purchase with a more devoted following. But the road, make no mistake, the road for him was paved by the whole nonsense of the hanging chads and issues on both sides of the aisle, saying elections. At some point about 20, 25 years ago, elections no longer settle elections. Elections got settled in lawsuits after the elections. Al Gore had the grace. He saw it. He would have been, he was a statesman in that moment. He said, "No, I concede. I don't want this to go any further." A little bit after the start, he might have been his allies might have been the crack in the dam, but they did start the fissures in the dam, which we've now seen. So nobody's innocent in this. Not Democrat, not Republican, not media, not me. Not anyone. But we have to try.
That's very true, yeah. And I do think there should be concern about our voting machines. I mean, some of this concern is legitimate. Now, in Virginia, when we vote, we have a paper ballot. It goes through a machine and it's counted by a machine, but the paper ballots are kept, and there's no hanging chads or anything. We use a pencil and we mark a piece of paper,
right? And
it's kept, and that's pretty simple. I mean, why can't everybody do that? I don't think a voting system should be entirely electronic, because you can, fiddle with that. Somebody can.
Right. There's hackers. There's white hat hackers. There's black hat hackers.
You could always have paper ballots. Always.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, it takes longer, and yes, none of us are patient anymore. But maybe maybe we need to learn patience. Maybe. A long time ago, somebody taught me something. This was from my regular life profession, but they said you should always, when you hear something and you want to be outraged about, stop, pause, breathe, think, pause again, then respond. I think we all sort of need that. It's almost like when our parents told us when we were little kids, count to 10, count to 10, cool off some. And I think we all need like a cooling off period, but an education as well, and better behavior by some actors. I have some thoughts on it. I mean, I think the biggest problem is, aside from a lack of personal ethics, which I'm not sure you can ever really change human nature, would be like some of the things you suggested, some third way of selecting judges. But I think if you required that all national elections were publicly financed, no exclusions, no exceptions, that would actually take a lot of money out of politics. And perhaps in that public election integrity bill would be that members of Congress could not trade stocks. They had a blind trust. They could not lobby for 5 years afterwards, or something like. No member of their nuclear family could. Whatever it is, but the public financing, so that they're not constantly fundraising all the time. And that would also give rise to the viability of third, fourth, fifth, sixth parties. I'm not sure that those kinds of coalition governments work better or neater, but at least it's more representative. So at least people can say, oh, well, it's a duopoly, and both sides they're both fighting for the same interests, and it's not you or me. You can't trust either of them. Well, at least if there were 5 or 6 parties that had significant numbers of elected officials in the national government, that would simmer that down some, and maybe we could get more bills that struck a consensus, because I do think that somewhere between 60 and 80% of most Americans agree on, large points of some of the more contentious issues, such as gun control, such as immigration, and tax reform. And if each party had a wish list of 10 things, but people only agreed on 6, well, do a bill with that 6. And all of these parliamentary games and procedural rules and offering of amendments and all these rules that the majority has to scuttle something and things like that could be more fairly addressed if the elected officials were more representative and less worried about chasing money.
Yeah, we've got to find a way to get big money out of politics. It's going to be really hard, though, because elections are expensive.
Well, that's true. And, listen, if you asked me a few years ago, do you believe in public financing of elections? I would find like 35-year-old me and younger would have found that absolutely abhorrent. I would have thought that was anathema to the system. But it's really the only thing I can think of to take money out of the game and get it to a fair place. And yes, it would be harder. It will require legislation which would survive strict scrutiny from the Supreme Court. But everything people want to do is hard. Gun control is hard because of the Second Amendment. Changing the number of senators or the number of Congress people, or making D.C. a state or Puerto Rico, all of these things are hard. They're just as hard. So if you can find one thing that can, maybe address the next 12 problems instead of one thing that only addresses one problem, maybe that's the one hard thing to tackle. Now, it's my idea. That's why I think I'm so smart and why I think it's the best idea, but it might not be. Maybe there's other ideas.
Well, here's where I think the media could help. In fact, some of us are trying to work on that here. When I turn on the local news, so much of it is about the latest murder or the latest 7-Eleven that gets knocked over or the latest fire, car crash, all that. There is limited coverage of government, what's going on with city council and the board of supervisors. Sometimes it's real sexy and controversial, and sometimes it's, routine. But there's one, our newspaper, we'll have to credit them, have started, and I think they've done this before, with a number of key questions of candidates. And there were 3 candidates in this one article that I read. And you could tell which candidates had spent some time on those questions and which candidates just blew them off. And if we could have more of that, more where people could compare the views of people that are prominent in the media. And people have become awakened now out of their lethargy because of the abortion issue. It's the only issue that people on one side or the other feel strongly about. And so it has caused them to come to the polls. But before that, a lot of people were quite lethargic about other important matters. And they didn't come. You don't just vote in November. You should get to the June primaries. They're sometimes more important than what goes on in November. And I knew, and this goes back to people poorly educated about how their government works. And I'll have to say, if I hadn't spent a little bit of time with the League of Women Voters, I wouldn't have known about precinct meetings, because I don't think I was ever taught about precinct meetings. But that's grassroots politics. And that's where the pro-life people, they figured out how to make the system work according to how they wanted it to work. And they figured it out, and they showed up, and other people didn't. And whether you agree with them or whether you don't, they figured out how to work the system according to their point of view. And Woody Allen said 80% of life is just showing up. And that is so true of elections. And I had, there was a good candidate for governor here several years ago who had a lot of support. He had a lot of real important people behind him. And, he was a really, really good guy. But his friends didn't show up for the June primary. They thought they could vote for him in November. They were that ignorant. And these were college graduates, doctors, lawyers, and so on. I wouldn't say lawyers, but, college graduates. They just didn't come to the June primary. He lost the primary. Hey, what happened? Oh, I don't know.
All right. Well, yeah, I think that we could probably discuss this forever. And, but I think the point is that people should maybe go back and relearn civics, the branches of government, what does federalism mean, what are the roles of the different branches of government, but also to choose to inform themselves, through a lot of ways. And listen, if this podcast is one of them, terrific, but you should absolutely not be relying on, what I say or think to be your thought. You probably shouldn't rely on what Suzanne Munson says or think to be what you think, but you should listen to her. You should read her book. You should listen to me, but you should also listen to other people as well and, form your own opinions and act accordingly, I suppose. All right. So if people want to buy I believe it's books plural, and otherwise follow and support you and follow your work, how can they do so?
Well, I have 2 books up on Amazon and online Barnes and Noble now. By the end of the year, I hope I'll have 3 more.
Oh, wow.
The first book that I wrote is called Jefferson's Godfather, The Man Behind the Man, or just Jefferson's Godfather. And that's the story of Jefferson's mentor, George Wythe, and all that he and others did to get this country off to the right start, to form a great democratic republic. And then the second book is about Thomas Jefferson. It's called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And if you're interested in metaphysics, I encourage you to take a look at that one. This is the premise is, if you could talk to Thomas Jefferson, if you could ask him questions about our government, the media, religion, higher education, what would he say about our institutions today? That's the premise of the book. It is a metaphysical book, but I think it's very highly rated on Amazon. You should read the reviews. And that's what Jefferson might say if I had written it. I didn't write it, but I completed it.
Okay, fair enough. Anything else or any place else?
No, I just everybody just stay as informed as you can from the most objective sources that you can find, and show up at the precinct meetings, regardless of your party. The parties can always be improved by better participation by well-meaning people.
It's true. I guess that's what they say. Get involved. Do something. Do what you can. Anyway, I hope that the audience found this to be enlightening and informative, but if nothing else, to inspire you to, find your own sources of information and maybe think about your opinions. While this was a U.S.-centric show, it probably applies to all democracies and probably folks in countries where you're aspiring to become a democracy or an emerging democracy as well. If somehow you're listening to me in North Korea, sorry, we can't help you. Maybe you're jealous of having this dispute or this problem internally. Everything's relative. Anyway, I thank you so much for joining us and lending us your time and your expertise and your insight. Good luck with the books. I think the metaphysical one on Jefferson does sound actually quite fascinating. It's like a sort of channeling, Virgil or something, or you can talk to Aristotle or whatever. I know it's a book. I know it's not real, but it still be sounds interesting. So thank you very much for joining us in Garden Views. And folks, please follow her stuff, buy the books, give them a read, give them a review, and rate and review this show. And we always appreciate your referrals as well. Can't thank the audience enough for retweeting and sending me words of encouragement. So appreciate that. And you'll hear from us next time on Garden Views.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
You are on the road, must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach your children well, their father's hell did slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry, so just look at them and sigh, and know they love you. And you of tender years can't know the fears that your elders grew by, and so please help them with your youth. They see the truth before they can die. Teach your parents well, their children's hell will slowly go by, and feed them on your dreams, the one they picked, the one you know by. Don't you ever ask them why, if they told you you would cry, so just look at them and sigh.